Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, and welcome to this Mad in America podcast. My name is Robert Whitaker, and I'm happy today to have the pleasure of speaking with Joanna Moncrieff. Now, I think most of Mad in America listeners and readers know Dr. Moncrieff pretty well and know her work pretty well, but I'd still like to give her a brief, proper introduction. Dr. Moncrieff is a psychiatrist who works in the National Health Service. I think you're a consultant to the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, and she's professor of critical and social psychiatry at University College London. In 1990, she co-founded what is known as the Critical Psychiatry Network, which today I think has about 400 psychiatrists who are members, about two-thirds of whom are in the United Kingdom. From my perspective, the Critical Psychiatry Network has been at the forefront of making a broad critique of the disease model of care. And without this network, I don't think that critique would be anywhere near as prominent or as sophisticated as it is today. Dr. Moncrieff is a prolific researcher and writer. Her books include De-Medicalizing Misery, The Bitterest Pills, The Troubling Story of Antipsychotics, The Myth of the Chemical Cure. And her latest book is titled Chemically Imbalanced, The Making and Unmaking of the Serotonin Myth. Now, this book in many ways is a follow-up to her 2022 paper, which looked at the serotonin story and concluded that there was no good evidence that a serotonergic deficiency was a primary cause of depression. And I have to say it caused quite the furor within the media and in the response from psychiatry. So, Joanna, it's such a pleasure to have you here, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Bob.
So what I'd like to do, we will be talking about your book, but I'd like, and I know our listeners would like to know, basically the path that you took to become a critical psychiatrist. Now, I believe you were in medical school in the late 1980s. And so my first question is, why did you want to be a psychiatrist?
So I'm afraid to disappoint people that I don't think there's been much of a character arc. So at medical school, I was already probably more interested in philosophy and politics than I was in medicine. And so I gravitated to the areas of medicine that were most politically and philosophically fertile and controversial, and that was inevitably psychiatry. So I was reading people like Thomas Saz and R.D. Laing already when I was at medical school. And I went into psychiatry after I finished studying. So I was already primed to look at psychiatry through a critical lens. But then when I started as a junior doctor working in the very last days of the old asylums, I'm really pleased that I fought that time, because it was really interesting. And I think now the asylums have gone, it's actually a bit more difficult to understand the psychiatric system than it was in the day when everyone was together in these big institutions. Anyway, so I was working in these old institutions in their very last years. They were all crumbling around you. And obviously everyone in those institutions was on multiple sorts of psychiatric drugs. And I was very strongly struck by the difference between what it said in the textbooks, which are, we've got these wonderful new drug treatments introduced in the 50s, revolutionized psychiatric care. Everyone gets better now and leaves the asylum, and that's why we're shutting them down. And the reality, which was people shuffling around wards, obviously zombified, obviously heavily sedated, maybe less symptomatic, but not really better, and certainly not recovered. So I suppose that confirmed my suspicions that, psychiatry was not as it was laid out in the textbooks.
I think that's interesting for two reasons. One is that it seems that the disease model of care that was being promoted, at least in the United States, starting in the 1980s and 1990s, it lacks any philosophical conception of what it means to be human and that sort of natural range of emotions, where our minds can go. It's so barren in that sense. But then the second thing you're speaking about is that you had clinical experience. That is so important, because your clinical experience just didn't jibe with the story that was being told. When we were in medical school in the UK, Were they teaching this sort of DSM-3 disease model, or did you hear a different story about what causes depression and that sort of thing?
When I was in medical school, we were taught, as we're still officially taught now, I guess, the biopsychosocial model of mental disorder. But what was different, really different then compared to today, is we were taught to do a formulation. So you took a long history from someone, and you went into their childhood and developmental history and their personal history, and then you put everything together, and you had to summarize relevant biological factors, but also relevant psychological and social factors. So although there was already a very strong biological current in psychiatry, at that time there was still the strong influence of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, and social psychiatry, I would say, much more so than today, when all we have is, please give us the diagnostic code for this patient, and then the treatment supposedly follows from that.
So you really were being taught to sort of understand the person's life
Yes, absolutely.
what was the
Yes.
context of their life and that sort of thing. Oh, one other question. So now you go out you're in the asylum or in mental hospital. Did you find that the patients in any way fit neatly into these different diagnostic constructs?
So absolutely not. I mean, that's as well as discovering how how the narrative about the drugs didn't fit reality. The diagnosis was probably even less congruent. I would say, even for a very mainstream psychiatrist, it's surely obvious that we've got these rigid boxes and we're trying to squeeze people into them. We've got a few sort of crude labels, and we're trying to squeeze this huge variety of human trouble and human confusion and human distress into these narrow boxes. Because then what you see is the box. You see the box, you see the label, and that's what you treat. Or that's what you're supposed to treat, rather than actually trying to help a person with their individual difficulties and their idiosyncratic ways of responding to life. What you're trying to do is treat a label as if everyone who has this label of depression has exactly the same thing going on.
Now, it's interesting that you're going through this in the 1990s in your own personal sort of experience and all. And here in the United States, we were hearing this story of extraordinary advances. Prozac fixed the chemical imbalance in the brain. We had new atypical antipsychotics, which is a story of great medical advance. And it fit into a larger narrative of the advance of medicine in the 20th century. Yet you co-founded the Critical Psychiatry Network. How did you and others find each other? And what did you see as your mission when you did this?
So I was aware, when I was still a fairly junior trainee psychiatrist, that there were other people who were similarly critical of the mainstream medical model. And when I got a job at the Institute of Psychiatry, I was working with a couple of colleagues, a couple of other trainees who were like-minded, and we set up a little book group, little reading group, and we read R.D. Laing and Thomas Szasz. So that's how it started. And then we thought we'd invite a few people to come and speak to us, because there was a nice lecture theatre. We could get them to come along to that. And I just happened to, I emailed Thomas Szasz on the off chance that he might be visiting the UK. He was. So we had Thomas Szasz speaking in November 1997 to a packed audience. So that was interesting. And then we got together with people from other parts of the UK. And what brought us together initially was the Labour government's decision to review the Mental Health Act. So they commissioned a big and thorough report led by a lawyer, which was actually quite a good report, on the Mental Health Act, which quite fundamentally questioned actually the whole premise of mental illness as a basis for incarceration, and suggested, or one of the options it put forward was that coercive treatment and hospitalization should be based on capacity rather than a supposed diagnosis of mental illness. That was, in the end, rejected. I think it was just seen as being too big a change and too complicated. But it was an interesting process, and we fed into that process. We put in a report to the information collecting part of that process of review.
So there were some political wins that lent you some support within society for what you were doing. Because one of the things that I think is interesting is the critical psychiatry group managed to survive within British psychiatry, whereas in the US, people who broke were really pushed out. They had a really hard time staying in the system.
Yeah.
So, two things, Joanna. How would you describe the critique that you advanced, the network advanced, how it was received, and how you did this? So, books, magazines, interviews, that sort of thing. And why did you survive in the UK, whereas here, people who broke with the conventional wisdom really had a tough time staying in their jobs and not being sort of dismissed by the media as cranks?
So I was reflecting on this when I wrote my recent book. Uh, My experience when I was a junior psychiatrist and a medical student was that psychiatry was really quite a supportive forum for debate. That even mainstream psychiatrists, mainstream biologically inclined psychiatrists, used to, welcome debate, not be too defensive, be able to, see other points of view. And as I say, when I invited Thomas Saz to come in 1997 to the Institute of Psychiatry, the heartland of biological psychiatry in the UK, the audience was packed, and some very mainstream biological psychiatrists showed genuine interest in his point of view. I would say that in the UK, that has changed somewhat over the last few years, and it feels like a much less comfortable place to have a debate nowadays. And just it's just less possible to have debate, really. I mean, even today, I would say that there seem to be far fewer critically minded psychiatrists in the US, or at least that I know of, because actually every now and then I come across someone who's been doing amazing work, helping people withdraw from antidepressants or something, in some little place I've never heard of, but hasn't linked up with us.
Yeah.
So I think that reflects what you say, that actually being outside the mainstream in the US is much more difficult, and you just really need to keep your head down.
What did you see as the sort of mission and impact of Critical Psychiatry Network over the past 20 years? Have you really managed to make this critique get into the mainstream and get in even into a little bit of the mainstream literature? Can you just talk about the accomplishments of the network?
The members of the network have published quite a lot. I mean, myself, but I've published quite a lot, but lots of other people have as well. Phil Thomas and Pat Bracken, who were leading members when we got started, published a lot, published books on post-psychiatry and things like that, as well as scientific papers. Duncan Double's been quite a prolific publisher. Hugh Middleton, Sammy Tamimi, yeah. So I mean, lots of us have published books and papers. So I think that's helped to build up a body of influential knowledge that's critical of mainstream approaches to mental health and psychiatric care. So I think that's been important, just to create that and have a body of literature that people can refer to. I think it's also been important for the rising survivor movement to be able to reference psychiatrists who agree with them, who are, share their criticisms of the mainstream model. Have we actually changed care? I mean, I don't know whether we have changed care. I think the survivor movement has changed things, facilitated by the internet and the ability of people now to link up. So antidepressant withdrawal, benzodiazepine withdrawal, sexual side effects, these have all really been put on the agenda by people who've been subjected to the harms of these drug treatments and have been brave enough to come out and speak about their experiences and highlight it. But I think that having us in, knowing that in the background there are professionals who agree with them has hopefully been helpful as well. I think having an alternative perspective available for people to find is so important, isn't it? I mean, there will be plenty of people who still want to subscribe to the disease model, and that's fine. But what I hope we have now achieved is that for people who think, actually, I don't like that idea, I'm going to go and explore if there are other ways of understanding my difficulties, there is a different way of thinking out there.
Well, and I know from the many people I've talked to who've re-envisioned their own sense of what was happening to them. I'm talking about psychiatric survivors being able to read what you all have been publishing and the critics have been publishing. That was pivotal for them to remake their own narrative, and so often the narrative then led to a much better place. So it's been absolutely essential, I think, to not just in a broad way, but to the individual lives of many, many people. Let's go back into the serotonin story because it is so critical or at the heart, in a way, of that biological story. Tell us just how did the hypothesis arise, and then how was it investigated?
So it goes all the way back to the 1960s, and these new drugs are coming into psychiatry, which starts with what we now call antipsychotics, which are used for people, are given to people with psychosis or who are diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then people start thinking, oh, well, if we've got a drug for psychosis that looks, as if it's a bit helpful, maybe we can find a drug for depression. So they start throwing various drugs at depression. Drugs that are completely different from each other, don't really have anything in common. So they try out iproniazid and isoniazid, which are drugs that are being used in TB, are almost certainly amphetamine-like substances with an amphetamine-like profile of side effects, including psychosis and insomnia. But then they also try out some chlorpromazine-like drugs. So those are really sedating, the tricyclic antidepressants. In the middle of all this sort of experimentation, people start to think, okay, we need some theoretical basis for this, and start to speculate on why and how drug treatment might be useful in people with depression. And that's where this idea comes up that maybe depression is to do with some abnormality in brain chemicals that is being corrected by the drugs that are being given. The first interest is actually in noradrenaline, because amphetamine, which, although it was not often referred to as an antidepressant, was being widely prescribed to people with depression, was known to stimulate noradrenaline. So noradrenaline was the chemical that sparked interest most back in the 1960s. But serotonin was also suggested to maybe be relevant to people with depression. So this idea that there's an imbalance, an abnormality, particularly a deficiency of chemicals such as serotonin and noradrenaline, is articulated first in the 1960s. It's then actually researched in a big research project funded by the NIMH in the US in the 1970s, which almost certainly finds nothing because it doesn't publish anything anyway. So by the 1980s, David Healy, must be an early paper by David Healy, is writing to say, this is dead in the water, this hypothesis that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance. It's dead, it's over. And then literally, probably the same year, it's picked up by Eli Lilly, who are the makers of Prozac, and other pharmaceutical companies who come along with their SSRIs and breathe new life into it and really recruit this idea, which has already been disproven, to market antidepressants. And the reason it's so useful, so vital to them, is that the use of drugs to numb and sedate people with emotional problems had got a really bad reputation by the end of the 1980s because of the mass prescribing of benzodiazepines and the revelation that benzodiazepines were just as dependence-forming as the barbiturates, even though they had been marketed as being free of this complication. And benzodiazepines, it's difficult to pretend that you're doing anything other than just drugging people's misery away, really, temporarily. So the pharmaceutical industry wanted to put a line between benzodiazepines and their new range of drugs. And so they marketed this new range of drugs, the SSRIs. Firstly, they chose depression rather than anxiety, which had been the main condition for which benzodiazepines were given. And secondly, they marketed them as a disease-specific, a disease-targeting treatment, as something that targeted an underlying abnormality, that rectified an underlying abnormality. So they told people that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance and that you need one of our drugs to put it right. That's why the idea was so important at that period of time to the pharmaceutical industry, and that's why it was just, disseminated all over our culture, so that everyone came to believe that it wasn't just an idea, it wasn't just a theory, it was a proven fact.
Well, here's the interesting thing is that, so the NIMH did one of their investigations, and they published in 1983 into this, and they said there's no evidence that low serotonin, in fact, is a cause of depression. And I think it was in 1998, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook said the monoamine theory of depression it just hasn't panned out. Yet, if you would have been in medical school in the United States in the 1990s, they were teaching the low serotonin theory of depression. New doctors were learning that was a fact. I mean, new psychiatrists. And I don't know how it was in the UK, but I think that so many, certainly GPs, but also psychiatrists came to believe that story.
I remember my training, and we were taught that it was a theory. And we were taught that there was evidence for it and evidence against it, like the dopamine theory of schizophrenia. Having said that, we had some very good teaching by a pharmacologist who wasn't a psychiatrist. So I expect teaching in different places varied. But if you look at textbooks, they do usually refer to it as a theory. They don't often say explicitly that it's been proven, but then you'll see something like, a table with causes of depression, serotonin imbalance, or, neurotransmitter abnormalities or something like that. So there was always an implication that there was more evidence than there actually was, even if you weren't explicitly told this has definitely been proven.
I understand why the pharmaceutical companies wanted this story. But why was psychiatry so interested in this story? And they promoted it like heck. I mean, that became their calling card, so to speak, at least again in the United States. They talked, there was even in 2007, I think, a press release put out by the APA saying that psychiatrists are experts in fixing chemical imbalances in the brain.
I think psychiatrists, or some psychiatrists, really want to believe that depression in particular is a proper medical disorder. And I think this actually stems from history and from the fact that psychiatrists were born and started off their lives in the asylum system. And then in the 20th century started to feel that, and probably before that, started to feel that being associated with the asylums and with people with chronic, severe mental health problems such as schizophrenia, so-called schizophrenia, was a bit stigmatizing. So they tried to develop an outpatient practice. And that really takes off in the mid part of the 20th century. And depression was one of the conditions that they chose to label the less serious conditions that they came across in outpatients and clinics and community services. And that helped them to develop a clientele of people who were not people with chronic, severe psychotic conditions, but people with less severe conditions. That was partly because of the stigma, but also probably partly because of the money. Thinking about it, there's probably not that much, in a commercial mental health, in a commercial health system. It's, of course, it's different in the UK because it's a nationalised service. But in a commercial system, there's not much money to be made out of people with chronic severe mental health problems, but probably quite a lot to be made out of people with less severe mental health problems.
But there is a sense, I think, that the profession became believers in their own propaganda, so to speak. When was it, 2009, you write The Myth of the Chemical Cure? So you understood it a long time ago that this had not panned out. So why do the research that led to your 2022 paper? If it seemed like it had been debunked, I mean, certainly readers of Mad in America were pretty well understood that that theory had been debunked. So why? And then you did it. It was an exhaustive effort. Why take up that effort with Mark and to do
Yeah.
it?
So I wanted to do it because there was nowhere to point to say that this has been debunked. You had to say, oh, well, there's a reference in this textbook that says that it's not supported, or a reference here, but there was no sort of substantial paper or piece of research that actually said, look, there really isn't any good evidence for this idea. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to bring together all the recent strands of research into the links between serotonin and depression in one place, look at, take an overview and come to a conclusion.
Let's talk about the reaction. And what you did in that book, of course, is you went through the history of research into it and the different types of efforts to see if they had low serotonin, because there's different types of experiments, and they look at metabolite levels and all that sort of thing. And no matter what was the method, you found that there never was a finding that really supported the theories. Is that fair to say?
None of the various areas of research that have looked at it, as you say, using different methods, found any consistent or convincing findings.
So, first of all, the media response. This gained a huge media response. I think it had quite an impact on the profession as well. If you look at the metrics for studies that are read, it's quite high up.
People were absolutely staggered, really surprised. I went on one television program and the presenter said, it blows your mind that this is not true. It really revealed that the general public have been persuaded by all this pharmaceutical industry and medical propaganda that depression has been established to be caused by a deficiency of serotonin. Not that this is just one theory that there might be a bit of, inconsistent research out there for, but that it was an established fact. That's what people thought. And so people were, really blown away to find out that it wasn't true.
So, I want to ask you about a question. When one of the responses by the psychiatrist is, "Oh, this is nothing new. We knew it all along." Well, when they say this, that really becomes a story of betrayal. So obviously, doctors have a responsibility to inform the public and their patients of what is known and to get consent on treatments based on what is known. But in essence, they were saying, we didn't tell this to our patients, even though we knew it. Can you speak to that sense of betrayal by a medical profession towards its patients?
Yeah, I mean, it's really shocking, isn't it? And I think I think the publication of our paper and the public reaction to it was profoundly embarrassing for the profession, because even if they hadn't been explicitly telling people that depressed people, they had a chemical imbalance, and we know that lots of doctors were telling people this, and probably still are, but even if they weren't, they hadn't stopped people from believing it. They hadn't stood up when the pharmaceutical industry was flooding, the airwaves with this message and said, actually, this is not established. This is not proven. You shouldn't be persuading people that this is the case. So I think it was really a profound embarrassment for the profession.
Well, as you know, on Mad America, we regularly publish first-person stories. And the story that comes out over and over again is how people feel their lives were dramatically changed by that story, that they went down a path, self-identity changed, and their use of these medications changed, and so often they had very bad long-term outcomes, and they really feel their lives were taken away from them in a large way. This wasn't a harmless betrayal, in my opinion. I don't know, maybe if you can speak to the sense of harm done from telling a story that's not true, which gets you to take the drug in your own conception of what's happening to you.
So I really agree with you. I think this has done so much harm. I really do. When people tell you about, their experiences, people will often say, "Oh, initially it was a relief. Initially it was great to think, okay, it's a simple problem. There's some abnormality in my brain. I can take a drug. It'll put it right." So sometimes people initially get feel a bit better and a sense of relief and like the idea. But then, as you say, it gets into people's view of themselves. It changes people's sense of their identity, and it is profoundly disempowering. Of course it is, to be told that that your emotional reactions are being controlled by some processes in your brain that you have no control over, you have no agency, and that you're going to need to go to the doctor and get some pill to tweak. And then, of course, the pill doesn't work. So then you think you're, a biological failure. You're even worse than being, than having a biological condition. You've got an untreatable biological condition. And you can really understand how that can set people off on a pathway to chronic debilitation and disability. There are many stories that testify to that. So, after I published the paper, one of the frequent questions was, well, if we can't give people antidepressants, then what can we do? People were sort of quite indignant that I should be criticizing the current view of depression and the current solution to depression without having a perfectly worked out answer to resolve everyone's emotional difficulties. But really what we should be saying is this answer this idea that we've had and this answer that we've suggested for it is incredibly harmful. And actually, if you take that away, the world will be a better place for it, even though that means that, yes, people will struggle with their emotions. Yes, we should definitely develop other forms of support, other ways of helping people. But actually, just getting rid of that really harmful idea would be a very good thing.
The other thing I heard was, and this came out in the United States when there was a little bit in National Public Radio when they sort of started questioning whether the low serotonin theories. And Daniel Carlett said, for example, well, I don't really believe it, but I tell people that anyway. Did you hear that? And if so, why is it okay to lie to patients? Is, I guess, why would psych professionals say, I lie to them for their own good? It's basically what that response was.
He said that. Ronald Pease said something quite similar. Carlyle also said that he wouldn't tell people that it was a serotonin imbalance anymore, but he'd say it was something similar. And the other person who put it, who said this, was Wayne Goodman, actually, who back in 2005 or 6, when Jeffrey Lacasse and Jonathan Leo published a paper on the serotonin hypothesis, which got some media coverage, Wayne Goodman responded. And he said that, I thought this was really interesting, that the chemical imbalance was a useful metaphor for the idea that depression is a brain-based problem. And that, I think, reveals the whole nub of it. That mainstream psychiatry desperately wants people to carry on thinking that depression is in the brain and that we can tweak the brain in some way to put it right. And they're very threatened by anything that really fundamentally questions that idea. That really speaks to my ideas about models of drug action and how there is such a deep belief in the disease-centered model of drug action that psychiatrists and doctors really cannot see round it. They cannot contemplate that there is an alternative explanation for what drugs are doing. So, in the case of antipsychotics and dopamine, I mean, antipsychotics clearly create, a highly abnormal, altered brain state, which alters people's behavior and thinking processes and emotions. And that is a perfectly sufficient explanation of how they affect people with psychosis and schizophrenia without having to, come up with any theories about dopamine abnormalities or anything else. But many psychiatrists just cannot contemplate seeing their drugs in that way. That's just maybe just too terrible to think that actually what we're doing is using chemical straitjackets or chemical pacifiers, as the barbarian psychiatrists of the past did. Because we're new scientific people, we can't possibly be seen to doing that, and therefore they just blank that out, and all they can see is that it must be some abnormality of dopamine.
So now let's go to your book. You have this big splash. Why write this book? And also talk about how, even though it's the making and unmaking of the serotonin myth, you're really now bringing it into what does this mean for how we think about depression, how we treat depression, what are the opportunities?
So I wrote the book to answer all the questions that people put to me after I published the paper. I was trying to address all these huge questions like, if it's not serotonin, then what is depression? If antidepressants aren't the answer, what is the answer? Do antidepressants work then? So I was trying to answer all these questions in interviews, and probably not doing a terribly good job. So I thought, right, okay, I'll sit down and do a good job of it and answer all these questions properly. So that was really the stimulus for writing the book, combined with the extraordinary reaction that it provoked from the general public and from the psychiatric profession, that I felt needed to be documented as an example of how vested interests shape what becomes received scientific wisdom, received scientific knowledge. Because I felt that after the publication of the paper, we saw how knowledge was shaped in action. We saw the psychiatric community coming together to counteract this challenge to their knowledge base, and to the knowledge that they put out there as the knowledge of psychiatry. And we saw how they came together to defend their point of view and make sure that any questioning was shut down. So I thought it was important to document that process.
Yeah, I think this is really important. Is what happened is when the low serotonin theory is debunked, it really becomes a challenge to the whole narrative they've told us and the narrative that we formed our lives around and they formed, that they sold to the public. So I think that's why you got such a thing. It wasn't just an element. It was their whole narrative now was collapsing. And of course, that's quite a threat. And I think you do a beautiful job in the book about achieving the aim you just talked about in terms of how this got formed and then the response. I think it's really important to understand the response because it was a response designed to defend the narrative. And you can see actually the flailing away of that response because they actually can't point to evidence that supports the narrative. That's their problem. That's their weakness. But then your book does go into, okay, so if that narrative is wrong, it's not one we should think about, it opens up a new narrative of possibility. And there's two parts to that, the way I see it. One is to just go back to, is it episodic and is it a response to environment rather than a flaw in your biology? And then also then, once you reconceive of depression as you present it, and I ask you to present it in this way, then the question becomes, well, do we use these drugs at all? And you can talk about maybe the drug-centered model, but why don't you talk about the opportunities that you present in this book that come from reconceptualizing depression?
Yes, and I think that's a really nice way to put it, because I'm often accused of being nihilistic, because I don't want to simply offer people a pill or some brain procedure to cure their troubles. But actually, I think reconceptualizing depression is a very positive and very optimistic thing to do, and helps to empower people and give people agency. And also it actually chimes with our underlying inclinations and beliefs, which were deliberately beaten out of us by the pharmaceutical industry and, by these sort of big propaganda exercises that were dressed up as disease awareness. So people used to understand depression as a natural reaction to bad things happening in people's lives. And there is, tons and tons and tons of research, which is not disputed, that shows that if you've been the victim of child abuse or child maltreatment, that if you've got financial problems and housing problems or relationship problems, you are more likely to have depression. You have an increased vulnerability to being depressed, and lots of other mental health problems as well. And that's how people used to think of depression. And if you think of it like that, then it's clear that all a drug can achieve is to numb or sedate you at best, to temporarily induce a little bit of oblivion that puts these things out of your mind. But it doesn't really help address the situation in any way. And also, if you think of it like that, it puts the emphasis back on looking at, well, why are you feeling like this? So we're asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking, what is your diagnosis and what's the correct treatment for your diagnosis? We should be asking, why do you think you might feel this way? What could it be that's gone wrong in your life, and what could be done about that? And that's not necessarily easy. Obviously, people, can be facing really difficult situations that are not necessarily very easy to change. But ultimately, I think that's a much more empowering view than being told that, that the problem's in your brain and you need to rely on the doctor's magic potion to put it right.
There was a 6-year study done by the NIMH that compared outcomes. This is in the 1990s for people who took medications and those who did not. And what they found is that those who did not made changes in their life, including getting divorced. And they actually ended at the end of 6 years with a better social standing than at the beginning. So they weren't frozen in place. But I think that goes to what you're talking about. It can be a signal that maybe you need to make changes in your life. And I agree. Cultural conditions can really be difficult to change, job and housing and all this. But and going back to your original thing, Joanna, this is a picture of a philosophy of humanity, what it means to be human. And so it sort of goes back to your philosophical roots as well.
Yeah, and on that point, I thought you put it really nicely at the beginning, Bob, that what it is to be human is a vast variety of reactions and patterns of behavior. So some people are more sensitive to bad circumstances than others. We're not all the same, and some people will, through what's happened to them in their childhood, or through their elements of their genetics or biology, will be more predisposed to react to things, dramatically. And so some people do get really severely depressed and, take to their bed and stop eating and drinking and stop going out. And often people will say to me, so surely that's biological, and surely you've got to give them antidepressants. But I don't think it's any more biological than any of our other reactions. Of course, biology is involved in everything we do, but that doesn't mean that something in some specific process in our brains that's driving our feelings or behavior. And as you point out, depression is almost always a temporary state. So those people who get into that really severe state do need looking after while they're in that state and do need support and care, but will come out of it. And we don't need to be zapping their brains with electricity or filling them full of antidepressants and goodness knows what else. We need to just be humanely looking after them and nurturing them until they find the strength themselves to get through it, which most people will.
The other thing about in terms of a conception of what it means to be human is I'm not the same person I was when I was 20 or 30 or 40. I mean, I was pretty anxious when I was 20, 25. I'm much less, as I grew older, I became less anxious. And I think again, the conception with the disease model is this is who you are and always will be, that you're like a fixed biological state, which again is not consistent with any sort of scientific understanding of how we evolve physically over time and all. So this is an optimistic story. I think we really need to emphasize that. What use do antidepressants then have? Do they have a place? So you have that person, whatever is coming to you. Is there a place? And if so, what is their place? And what do you think of that?
I'm not sure that antidepressants have any use. And I wouldn't say that about all psychiatric drugs. I think antipsychotics have a place, for example, I think they can be helpful when someone's really acutely psychotic, just to suppress that psychosis if it's, really uncontainable in other ways. But I'm not convinced that antidepressants are that useful. So if we think of antidepressants in a drug-centered way, that means trying to understand what sort of alterations they produce. And undoubtedly, one of the alterations they produce is to numb people's emotions. So to reduce the intensity of negative emotions like depression and anxiety, but also the intensity of happiness and joy and excitement and positive emotions. And that seems to go along with their the sexual effects that they have as well, that they reduce sexual sensitivity and libido. So in theory, antidepressants might be useful in reducing the intensity of depressive feelings if someone is really depressed. But the trouble is, if you look at the research, I'm not sure that it actually confirms that they are useful. The differences between antidepressants and placebo are minuscule, not clinically significant, and easily explained by other by artifacts of the randomized trials, such as the fact that people can detect whether they're on the antidepressants or the placebo, at least in some trials to some extent, and therefore they're not fully double-blinded. So I'm not sure that the evidence suggests that they really have any use at all. However, there may be people who feel that something that makes them feel numb for a short period might be useful, and I wouldn't want to deprive people of trying them if they really want to, and if they really feel that might be useful. What I would say to both prescribers and people who are thinking of taking psychiatric drugs is never take anything for longer than you really, really need to, because the longer you're on something, the more your body will adapt, the more it'll be difficult to come off, and the more, harm will accumulate.
So just to conclude, the reaction to your book, as opposed to the reaction to your paper, it is a reaction to we've been doing things. I mean, your book is saying we've been doing things wrong. It's been harmful. We need to rethink this whole thing. So it's not just about unmaking the myth. It's about like unmaking the way we take care of people. So what's been the response from the profession to this book? Because it's a big challenge to conventional treatments.
So I'm afraid it's been entirely predictable. It's been more of, but they work, antidepressants work, and it doesn't matter how they work. That's all that matters. They work and they save lives. Of course, there's no evidence they save lives, but these. So that's been the response. Just to double down and defend the use of antidepressants, which doesn't bode very well, I'm afraid, does it?
I'm talking about the defenders of the faith, which mostly is coming from the profession. What is amazing to me is like they want to be people who practice evidence-based medicine, right? That's one of their ways they promote themselves to the public. And they'll say antidepressants work, but they can never point to research that really shows they work. Beyond like some minor thing over placebo and industry-funded trials, which, as you say, even the meta-analyses show it's not clinically significant. So how do they get away with that in their own mind?
I don't know whether in their own mind. I mean, I think, like you say, there's an awful lot of cognitive dissonance going on. But I think one of the problems is there is just so much research, and people are easily swayed by big numbers. So if you say, we've got thousands and thousands of patients who've taken antidepressants, and we've got a p-value of, less than 0.001, people will be enormously impressed. I'm afraid that includes doctors who should know better and should have much better training in critical appraisal and statistical interpretation. And people see what they want to see in scientific research, don't they? So if you want to believe that something's effective, you'll be able to interpret the research in the way that you want to very often.
So last question. You personally, together with the Critical Psychiatry Network, I think have had a profound impact on the narrative that is out there for the public. And there's a conventional narrative, but there's a pretty strong counter narrative that grows and grows and grows. And you certainly have been at the center of creating that counter narrative. What is your thought for the future? Is that disease model narrative going to sustain itself, or is it going to finally collapse and we'll get a paradigm shift? What's your crystal ball telling you?
So my crystal ball tells me that it's not going to disintegrate anytime soon because it's so useful to so many people with power. But I think it is creaking at the seams now. I think it's more fragile than it was. And I'm pleased to have contributed to that process. But I think the main credit needs to go to the survivor movement, facilitated, as I say, by the internet, which can now bring people together so that they can finally be heard and find each other. Yeah,
there's something about personal stories also when they collect that have a power beyond any sort of p-values and that sort of thing. Well, Joanna, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you, and I know our listeners are going to be eager to hear from you.
It was a pleasure, Bob. Really nice. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.